This is TWiT.
Lenovo. Leo, I heard you refer to Lenovo's UEFI problems on some podcast recently. So, this has been in the news a lot.
Oh, yeah.
It's not surprising.
I'm aware of it because I buy a lot of Lenovo hardware.
Yes,
so
that's been the ThinkPad, right?
Yeah.
I
love the ThinkPad.
Yes, the premier laptop. So, as we know, when a PC is powered up, something needs to wake up and configure the various parts of the machine. The video needs to be started. The fans need to spin up. All of the machine's various mass storage subsystems need to be initialized. And then the firmware's configuration needs to be checked. The proper operating system needs to be located, and its OS boot code needs to be initially loaded into RAM so that control can be turned over to it to continue booting the machine. The first PCs did that using their basic input-output system, BIOS or BIOS. That was good for about 5 years. It actually didn't last very long because the PC just exploded in terms of what everybody wanted to do with it. So the limitations which had been built into the BIOS's assumptions began to cause more problems than they were worth almost automatically. And various Mickey Mouse workarounds were created to overcome many of these problems while Intel worked on a wholesale replacement of the BIOS. The initial attempt was the EFI, the so-called extensible firmware interface, which quickly matured into the unified extensible firmware interface, UEFI. And we find ourselves right back where we always do. The original BIOS was so dumb that it could not be infected. It was originally implemented in
sometimes dumb is a good thing.
That's exactly. It was originally implemented in masked ROM, meaning that the firmware's bits were etched into a metal mask at the factory and could never be changed. It did mean you had to get the code right the first time.
No updates.
And that was something people used to be able to do, but we don't do that anymore. So that soon gave way to non-volatile flash ROM, which could be updated, but the code it implemented was still blessedly dumb. Sometimes, for some things, the dumber the better. Because if all you want is to boot an OS, you really don't need that much smarts. The BIOS did it just fine. And the lesson we keep falling into, and we keep failing to learn, is that the more complicated, fancy, capable, and smart we make things, the more leeway and latitude the system has to go very badly wrong. So, welcome to the unified extensible firmware interface where malware is also able to extend the firmware. Lenovo has been most recently in the "we made a UEFI mistake" news recently. Last week, the guys over at ESET, whose motto is "We live security," posted the results of their analysis of some widely used Lenovo UEFI firmware. Their posting's title was, quote, "When secure isn't secure at all, high-impact UEFI vulnerabilities discovered in Lenovo consumer laptops." And the story's tagline is, ESET researchers discover multiple vulnerabilities in various Lenovo laptop models that allow an attacker with admin privileges to expose the user to firmware-level malware. Okay, firmware-level malware. That's not what you want to hear. That's even less what you want to have crawling around inside your machine. Firmware-level malware enables the ultimate in rootkit techniques. In fact, having its own worst name, bootkit. The presence of firmware-level malware means quite simply that it's impossible to trust anything about what the machine might do. Firmware-level malware is able to infect and compromise the operating system's own code during its boot process before it has had any opportunity to raise its own shields. And reformatting the machine's mass storage and reinstalling an operating system, or even removing and replacing a drive, won't necessarily eliminate the problem, because this malware has taken up residence in the machine's underlying firmware on the motherboard, on a non-volatile memory soldered to the main board. Now, we know that anybody can make a mistake, and I am, as our listeners know, I am infinitely forgiving of mistakes. But the most troubling aspect of what the ESET researchers found was that 2 of the 3 big mistakes Lenovo made were the oversight of leaving highly exploitable drivers in the UEFI firmware image, which should have only been present during the firmware's development. These drivers should have never left the factory. So it's not like they got, a loop condition wrong or something like a mistake. They've left stuff in there that should not be in there. How do we know? We know because the 2 drivers were actually named Secure Backdoor. That's in the UEFI firmware, that's the driver's name. Yeah, we're going to
talk about an oxymoron, secure backdoor.
Yeah. Turns out it wasn't. Yeah. The other one was secure backdoor PEIM. So here's what ESET said. They said, ESET researchers have discovered and analyzed 3 vulnerabilities affecting various Lenovo consumer laptop models. Various. Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. The first 2 of these vulnerabilities, and we got 2 CVEs from this year, 39, 71, and 72, affect UEFI firmware drivers originally meant to be used, this is ESET, only during the manufacturing process of Lenovo consumer notebooks. Unfortunately, writes ESET, they were mistakenly included also in the production firmware images without being properly deactivated or deleted. These affected firmware drivers can be activated by an attacker to directly disable SPI flash protections, that is using control register bits and protected range registers, or the UEFI secure boot feature from a privileged user mode process running OS runtime. Okay, so just to be clear about what ESET just said, they said from a privileged user mode process in the OS. In other words, mistakenly, any user of these laptops, mistakenly allowing some malware to run in their OS, which might innocently ask to be granted brief UAC privilege elevation to install something, if it didn't bring along its own privilege escalation vulnerability exploit, as it might, or which might set itself up to run as a system service. That code can disable all relevant UEFI write protections to then surreptitiously install semi-permanent hidden bootkit malware into the system's UEFI firmware, and the user would be none the wiser. And we don't know how to scan for that yet. There's been some talk of scanning UEFI. Nothing much has come of it. ESET said it means that exploitation of these vulnerabilities would allow attackers to deploy and successfully execute SPI flash or ESP implants like LoJacks. To understand how we were able to find these vulnerabilities, consider the firmware drivers affected by, and then this is the CVE number, the 3971. They wrote, these drivers, imagine this, Leo, immediately caught our attention by their very unfortunate but surprisingly honest names: Secure Backdoor and Secure Backdoor PEIM. After some initial analysis, we discovered other Lenovo drivers sharing a few common characteristics with the secure backdoor asterisk drivers. Those are CHG, I guess that's short for change, and then boot DXE hook and CHG boot SMM. SMM is system management mode stuff, which is the OS under the OS. As it turned out, they write, their functionality was even more interesting and could be abused to disable UEFI secure boot. That's the CVE ending in 3972. In addition, they said, while investigating the vulnerable drivers, we discovered a third vulnerability, Smm Memory Corruption, inside the SW-SMI handler function. Thus, we have CVE ending in 3970. This vulnerability, they said, allows arbitrary read-write from into SMRAM, which can lead to the execution of malicious code with full SMM privileges. That's like the chip-level privileges, nothing more privileged in the world than that. And, they said, potentially lead to the deployment of an SPI flash implant. We reported all discovered vulnerabilities to Lenovo on October 11th, 2021. And I didn't have it in the show notes, but Lenovo responded a month later. Although the list of affected devices contains, and here it comes, more than 100 different consumer laptop models with millions, many, of users worldwide, from affordable models like IdeaPad 3 to more advanced ones like Legion 5 Pro or Yoga Slim 9. The full list of affected models with active development support is published in the Lenovo advisory. In addition to the models listed in the advisory, several other devices we reported to Lenovo are also affected, but won't be fixed due to them reaching end of development support, EODS. This includes devices where we spotted reported vulnerabilities for the first time, IdeaPad 330 and IdeaPad 110. The list of such EODS devices that we have been able to identify will be available in ESET's Vulnerability Disclosures repository. And what this tells us, reading between the lines, is that these vulnerabilities have been there long enough for those machines which they started affecting to now have gone out of their service life with Lenovo. Thus, they will never be fixed. Lenovo, oh yeah, I do have in the notes, Lenovo confirmed the vulnerabilities on November 17th, 2021, and assigned them the following CVEs. And I mean, they're coming right out with it. CVE ending in 3790, Lenovo variable SMM, and they say hyphen, SMM arbitrary read-write. The one ending in 3971, secure backdoor, disable SPI flash protections. And 3972, change boot DXE hook, disable UEFI secure boot. So, given how incredibly active the cyber underworld is today, we keep encountering quite sobering evidence of it, in every podcast now. There's just no chance that these now fully disclosed and very well documented vulnerabilities will not be used to compromise the interests of some of these millions of Lenovo laptop users worldwide, and many of them are, going to be serious users. It will happen. So here we are once more noting that there's something very wrong with our industry's current development model. How can this be allowed to occur over and over and over? ESET had to reverse engineer the proprietary code in this UEFI firmware in order to find these problems. It's affecting, Lord knows, what multiple of millions of Lenovo laptop users. Lenovo messed up big time here, but for the record, they're not alone. These newly disclosed vulnerabilities merely add to the recent disclosure of more than 50 UEFI firmware vulnerabilities which have been found in inside softwares, INSYDE, inside softwares, inside H2O, and HP and Dell laptops since the start of just this year. Among those are 6 severe flaws in HP's firmware affecting both laptops and desktops, which when exploited could allow attackers to locally escalate to SMM privileges, which, as I said, is as much as you can get on any hardware platform, and trigger at least denial of service and maybe more. So, Lenovo is in good company, or at least only the most recent member of this UEFI vulnerability doghouse. And as we know, it's not Lenovo's first instance of UEFI problems. We've years ago, they've also had problems. So we've managed to make our lovely little machines far more complex by designing in extremely powerful capabilities. Yes, we get lots more flexibility. We get remote management and remote maintenance. And not surprisingly, it's also a mixed blessing. So, a heads up to anyone using Lenovo laptops, regardless of the model you have. Don't look at a list of affected models. First of all, there's hundreds. You should definitely check in to see whether your device has a firmware update outstanding. And for that matter, HP and Dell users would be well advised to do the same.
Do you think these changes are driven by the needs of enterprise? In other words, are we personal and home users and geeks suffering because they want these management capabilities built in for enterprise?
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Exactly that, Leo.
Yeah. There should be, and there are a few places where you can get simpler systems with simpler UEFI and core boot open source firmware, things like that. And they are really not aimed at enterprise. What was the other thing I wanted to mention? Oh, yeah, firmware updates now, it's interesting, are increasingly part of the operating system update. I don't know if you've noticed that.
Yeah. Well, we know that Windows, for example, is patching the Intel chipset firmware.
Right.
Linux brings along the same thing.
Exactly.
And to their credit, although it is a little a bit of a mixed blessing, Lenovo now has software that comes pre-installed on their machines, which is taking responsibility for keeping your machine's firmware up to date. So it makes it better than if you never ever having the opportunity to proactively inform Lenovo machine owners and having a problem like this out there that would make them persistently vulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah.